Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Welcome, everybody, to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and have leftist discussions. With me today is Justin, Lil Andy, and Jeremy. My name is 8Hop, I'll be your host today.
Today's discussion is going to center around the German Revolution. I suppose I'm the subject matter expert on this one. Spent quite a bit of time in the last few months researching and many sources.
Yeah. So let's talk about the context. Like, what is the context of the German Revolution?
Okay.
What was happening before then and around that time? What brought about the context of the revolution?
So much like the Russian Revolution, World War I was a precipitating factor. It was something that, because it drew so many of the imperialist, sort of quasi-capitalist powers into it, they were weakened, and therefore it gave the working class in Germany, much like it did the working class in Russia, the ability to rise up and seize power. So that's sort of the background, the context of
what were the differences in mentality between the working class at that time and the upper class at that time?
That is a difficult question to answer because not much is written from the perspective of the working class. Most of the people who led the revolution were, I guess, what you would call intellectuals, or people who were involved in revolutionary thought prior to the revolution and simply took a leadership role during the revolution.
So who were those people originally? Like, what were their family backgrounds starting out, working class versus upper class?
So we had people like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and Mueller. They were all people who were generally of not necessarily extremely poor, not necessarily extremely rich. They were somewhere in the middle, I suppose you would say lower middle class or middle class. Rosa Luxemburg coming from Poland. Liebknecht was Jewish, so that was a factor in some of his opinions on right-wing nationalism and imperialism. Fascism obviously did not exist as an ideology at that time, but the nationalism and anti-Semitism that brought it to bear, I suppose, existed, going back to the Middle Ages in Europe. So,
what was like the centrist or populist opinion politically?
It's interesting because at that time, the party which had the highest number of seats in the Reichstag, and therefore the most political power outside of, the Kaiser and the German High Command and whatnot, would be the SDP, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And I suppose it's important to understand the context of social democracy up to this point. Prior to the early 20th century, social democracy was synonymous with democratic socialism. It was only in the early 20th century that social democracy began to shift into what we understand it to be today, which is a reformed form of capitalism. And the SDP was at the forefront of that change, which is what caused the USPD, which is the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, to split off. The USPD were more traditionally democratic socialists, although they continued to refer to themselves as Social Democrats, whereas the SPD went off in this new direction of, capitalism is never going to fall, or at least we can reform capitalism to the point that, the working class is no longer suffering, and that will bring about an intellectual revolution, which will then bring about socialism. Of course, it doesn't work.
So reform in what way, for people who aren't very familiar with democratic socialism or social democracy? What are the fundamental principles of those beliefs, and what are their pros and cons, and how does that relate to the politics of the time?
So, democratic socialism is a theory of socialism where the understanding is we can elect socialists into office who will enact socialist reforms which will establish socialism. Democratic socialism is separate from social democracy now, in that social democracy seeks to maintain capitalism but to address its contradictions by raising taxes and providing social programs that essentially, I suppose, if we look at the bourgeoisie as taking the money from the working class, social democracy says, okay, well, let's take that money back and give it back to the working class. It's essentially the government is a middleman which returns the stolen wages back to the working class, I suppose is the best way to put that.
How does that differ from traditional socialism?
Socialism itself is a matter of the people who do the work receive the full benefit of their labor. So if, the four of us in this room owned a company together and we all put in 40 hours a week and we have X amount in profit, we split X amount amongst the four of us equally, assuming that we all have the same role and, whatnot. That's socialism. Social democracy would be, I own the company, the three of you work for me, and taxes on me are higher than they are on the rest of you, and you receive more social benefits from the government than I would.
All right. Okay, so World War I has ended.
Sure.
Obviously, a major part of what's going to lead up to the German Revolution. What's the state of Germany at this point in the world? What is leading up to this moment?
So the German Revolution actually begins before the end of World War I. It transpires because in the waning months of World War I, Germany is destined for defeat. The powers which have allied against Germany are definitely going to win. So the German High Command, in sort of a last-ditch effort, decides that they're going to send their navy into the North Sea and into the English Channel to harry and destroy the British Navy, because they hope that if they destroy the British Royal Navy, it will put them in a better negotiating position in terms of surrender. So, as they command their naval forces into the North Sea and into the English Channel, their main naval base at that point is in Kiel, and there is already established a Kiel Sailors Union. And the Kiel Sailors Union says, fuck no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go into the North Sea. We're not going to risk our lives and die just so you can put yourselves in a better negotiating position. So they go on strike. They refuse to launch their ships. The sailors never board the ships. And there was a plan to essentially take right-wing loyalist sailors, put them on the boats, and sail them out of the harbor. The Sailors' Council were intending to then block the passageway out, but that never came to fruition because the German High Command collapsed shortly thereafter. But that was we'll say that's the spark, I suppose, that set off the German Revolution. Following that, in Bremen, there was a workers' council established in Bremen, which went and broke out a bunch of leftist leaders from prison in Bremen. In Bavaria, a workers' council was established. In Munich, a workers' council was established. Soldiers' councils were brought together in various places where there was a strong military presence, and they all individually decided, we're done, we're not going to fight this imperialist war, we will grind Germany to a halt if we have to, and that is what set off the German Revolution.
So, real quick, because we're talking about the historical aspects and where the beginnings were, let's take a second to reflect on where it all ended up. And I want you to talk about the differences between the democratic socialists of Germany, the socialists of Germany, and what ended up being the national socialists of Germany, and how those differentiate from each other. And then we can talk about how one became the National Socialists of Germany, the famous Nazi Party.
And that was a process. It didn't happen immediately, and it didn't even happen during the revolution. The German Workers' Party were sort of the predecessors to the Nazis, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. They were fiercely nationalistic. They were populist, for sure, but they were right-wing populists. By right-wing, I mean in context of against the Social Democrats and the USPD and later the KPD, the Communist Party of Deutschland.
Communist always seems cooler than kidding.
It did, a little bit. So the German Workers' Party were, their economic programs were very much like the Democratic Party here in the United States. Liberal, infrastructure-based, subsidizing capitalist interests, things of that nature. That's kind of the interesting thing, I think, about the Nazi Party is that they are labeled as far right, and they are from a particular perspective. They were nationalistic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, very much opposed to the rights of marginalized groups. But as far as their social programs and their spending packages and ways of bolstering the German economy, they're not that far to the right of the Democratic Party of the 1930s in the United States. That's kind of the complex issue of, left and right. It's not a cut and dried one or the other thing. I think that the Nazis were essentially a kind of a combination of the Republican and Democratic parties of the 1930s here in the United States, and then just, as far to the authoritarian end of the spectrum as one might warrant in Western Europe.
So if you were to establish a fundamental belief structure of the Nazi Party and compare that to the Socialist Party, let's say the Rosa Luxemburgs of the time, what would those differences be? Well, the USPD at the time would be internationalist, bent on worker control of the means of production, concerned with... It's a very difficult question, mostly because there was never a point at which Rosa Luxemburg, the KPD, the USPD, or there was a faction of the USPD known as the Spartacists, of which Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were members. There was never a point at which they had primary power of the government. The SPD always was, as far as political power was concerned, in control. And I think it's important at this point to talk about Friedrich Ebert. Sorry, I'm always trying to pretend he's French. So Friedrich Ebert was he was kind of the head of the SPD at the time of the German Revolution, and when all of these councils began to establish themselves and dictate economic measures, Friedrich Ebert was terribly concerned with, I suppose, talking out of both sides of his mouth. He pretended to and publicly spoke about his support for the workers and their struggle, but in private, he spent most of his time attempting to undermine the workers' councils and their power. He was opposed to violent revolution, but more than that, he was opposed to upending the social order. He wanted to maintain things as they were as much as he possibly could. In fact, prior to the end of World War I, he went to the German High Command and begged them to depose Kaiser Wilhelm and replace him with one of the princes who was more socially liberal, because he thought, we can keep the Imperial German High Command, we can maintain the social order, but this prince will be kinder to us than Kaiser Wilhelm was.
Why would anyone want to continue to maintain the empirical nature of the German Empire?
I think it was a matter, again, of this was he thought that chaos would lead to anarchy, and anarchy would lead to a collapse of the German Republic, and therefore, the end of any possibility of assisting the German working class. He was, I guess, to some degree nationalistic, and that was borne out in some of the decisions he made later.
Okay, so what actually happens that we would call a revolution
Okay, so following the establishment of all these councils throughout Germany, Karl Liebknecht called for Kaiser Wilhelm to step down and for democracy, I suppose, to rule in Germany. It happens, of course, Wilhelm abdicates. Ebert steps forward and tries to make himself the face of the revolution, which then harms his influence with the right wing. And then
swipes right is what
swipes
you're
right,
saying.
yeah. When exactly, that's exactly what I'm talking about. He attempted to swipe right with the right, and they swiped hard left. They were
As you have to do eventually.
The right wing was definitely not interested in working with Friedrich Ebert on any sort of meaningful level. However, he courted them constantly, and this began with the establishment of what's known as the Executive Council. So the Executive Council was sort of a governmental body which controlled, to some degree, the councils which existed throughout Germany. He put a right-wing nationalist in as his spy. And this was the first time, although definitely not the last, that Ebert dallied with nationalists. So this guy, he went in and spied, gave information to Ebert about what the council was doing, what their goals were, and as soon as the Executive Council figured out that this guy was a nationalist, they booted him immediately, but not before Ebert had received, some spy information, some secret plans and whatnot of what they were doing. Repeatedly, Ebert voted for and pushed for within the Reichstag that they maintain power, that no political power be given over to the workers' councils. Again, this was his tactic. He would, on the one side, say, "Oh, workers, I support your struggle, and long live the revolution," and things of that nature, and then turn around and undermine the workers' councils at every turn. And it's important to note that although the SPD had the majority control of the Reichstag, the USPD, of which initially Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were a part, had the most influence and the most membership amongst workers' councils, sailors' councils, and soldiers' councils, because that's where they saw the power of the people existing. They were attempting to establish what is known as council communism.
Real quick, define what that is, and then...
Sure. So it was based around the Russian Soviets. The Soviets were also workers' councils. That's what a Soviet is, literally. So the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is the Union of Workers' Council Socialist Republics. They took that idea in the early days of the Russian Revolution and expanded it throughout the country. And it worked up to a point, except that within Germany, the authority of the Reichstag was accepted above the authority of the workers' councils or the executive council, and therefore the Reichstag refusing to allow the workers' councils to have any significant power meant that the German people just sort of accepted the fact that the workers' councils didn't have any power and that the Reichstag did.
So what would be kind of the fallout or the resolution to what had been then boiling it up to this point?
It's interesting because the revolution was not just the overthrow of the Kaiser. It was the establishment of the councils. It was what they call the period of dual power, which is where the councils existed and the Reichstag governed, and it could have gone the other way. It is totally possible, had the workers' councils demanded the dissolution of the Reichstag, had the workers risen up and forced the parliamentary government to dissolve, that the workers' councils would have established themselves as the only power in Germany. But they didn't, and Ebert, again, undermined them, eventually brought in the German military to attempt to put them down. That is the point at which the revolution went, I suppose, violent, because up to this point, it had been largely a bloodless revolution. Nobody opposed the German people up to this point. They had prevented the naval ships from launching. The soldiers had refused to march. The workers' councils went on strike. It had essentially, they brought Germany to heel without ever really bringing about any bloodshed of significant note. But again, because Ebert was so bent on maintaining the current order of things and making sure that it didn't shift in a dangerous, quote-unquote, direction, his concern was with keeping order and keeping things the way they were as much as possible. So he went to the former officers' corps and said, please, I'm begging you, take control of the German military. Take it away from the soldiers' councils, lead troops into Berlin, we'll put down the soldiers' councils, we'll put down the workers' councils, let's return order to things. And so he did. But literally a crowd of German women and German children surrounded the soldiers and made fun of them, teased them, pointed fingers and said, you cowards, you're attacking a bunch of your fellow workers, what's wrong with you? And the military retreated after being made fun of. But that was the point at which Ebert was like, well, if the military can't do anything, what can I do? And he went to what's known as the Freikorps, which was essentially a mercenary group. I suppose the Blackwater of the 19th century. They had been around for, at that point, 100 years-ish, and had been called into service to supplement the German military whenever it was needed. They were primarily nationalistic, very much right-wing, but mercenaries. They were paid, a lot of them were former soldiers.
Who do they get paid by?
By the German government as needed. So Ebert calls them and says, look, can you deal with this problem? Because the military won't. The next action that Ebert took prior to actually sending the Freikorps into battle was to depose the Berlin chief of police, because this man had refused to send the police in to put down strikes. He had refused to deploy the police against workers, and he was a USPD member. So automatically Ebert saw him as the enemy. So he deposes this guy, brings in someone else, and spontaneously throughout Berlin, protests erupt everywhere because they saw this man as their ally. And with his deposition and his replacement with someone who was more friendly to, right-wing elements and more willing to deploy the police against workers, people were obviously upset.
Were the people protesting workers, families, both?
All of the above. It was 30,000 people went into the streets in Berlin.
And the people Ebert was having put these strikes down, who were they? What were their political leanings? Where did they come from?
The Freikorps were, again, largely nationalistic, largely right-wing. It was a mixed bag. Again, they were mercenaries, so anybody who was willing to take money, essentially, to go fight wars, and of course more than the military was paying. So they were not all nationalists, and they were not all right-wing, but primarily that's who they were. So this is the point at which both conservatives and left-wing people get this wrong. Misconception, I suppose. The uprising which followed these events was not orchestrated by Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, because at this point the USPD had decided that they were going to participate in parliamentary elections. And in fact, Lenin, of all people, encouraged them to.
This is
post-Russian Revolution, yes. So the Russian Revolution had already transpired. Lenin encouraged the USPD to participate in parliamentary elections. Rosa Luxemburg also argued that they should participate in parliamentary elections.
Reform on your way to revolution.
Correct. And Karl Liebknecht was like, nah, fuck this. We're not going to participate in parliamentary elections. We're going to go ahead and split away. And at this point, they were known as the Spartacist League. They broke away from the USPD. They joined a bunch of other left groups in Germany and formed what is known as the KPD, the Communist Party of Deutschland. They held a conference prior to the deposition of the police chief in which they discussed a path forward. Again, Rosa Luxemburg argued that they ought to participate in parliamentary elections because her feeling was if they didn't have the support of the majority of the German people, then their cause was lost. Karl Liebknecht did not think that they should participate in parliamentary elections. However, he opposed violent revolution, and in fact, most of the Spartacist leadership, most of the KPD opposed violent insurrection.
So what does Liebknecht actually want? Doesn't want parliamentary change? Doesn't
was-
want violent change?
he was hoping-
Sounds like a lost democratic socialist.
He was hoping that the councils would rise up together and seize state power as a group. He was hoping that that was like
pipe dream to end all pipe dreams.
that was Mueller as well. Anyway, so the KPD had voted not to participate in elections, but had also voted not to rise up violently. However, when the police chief had been deposed, spontaneously the protests erupted and
Protests by who and over what?
over the firing of the police chief. These people were upset that this person who was seen as an ally of the people had been removed from power. Throughout Berlin, these people rose up. Most of it was just a general strike. The problem is that the KPD did not have sufficient influence over the councils in Berlin or anywhere else. So when the strikes happened, a lot of them turned violent, of course, as they are wont to do from time to time. And the leadership of these individual cells had no guidance. There was no central leadership to tell them where to go or what to do or where to, this is where you need to go to seize this particular apparatus, whatnot. It was chaos, essentially. However, Ebert saw this as a meaningful way for him to vilify his political opponents. And his political opponents were not, of course, the right. His political opponents were the left. Which is shockingly. We're talking about the people who are most politically aligned with the SPD had to be the USPD. The Spartacist League were the far left of the USPD. They split off and formed the KPD, so maybe those people were not
Was
the most...
the KPD farther left than the USPD?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were...
I'm sorry, the Spartacist League, were they farther left than the KPD?
No,
I'm sorry,
no.
the KPD was farther left than the Spartacist League.
The Spartacist League were the bulk of the KPD. The Spartacist League were the far left of the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party. The USPD were classical Social Democrats, which is to say Democratic Socialists. When Ebert and the rest of the Reichstag made it clear that democracy was not going to solve this problem, that is the point at which the Spartacist League broke away, joined other left groups, and formed the KPD. Ebert saw Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, and the rest of the KPD as his enemies more than anyone else, because they were agents of chaos, whereas even the most right-wing elements in the Reichstag were there to maintain order. So he referred to maybe we could call it the Second German Revolution, or we could call it, the continuation of the revolution, but he referred to it as a Spartacist uprising. And that's what leftists call it now, is the Spartacist uprising. Even though the Spartacists had very little control over the workers' councils, they had little influence over what was going on, even though prior to this event, they opposed violent revolution openly and directly in word and writing.
Do you know how they ended up getting credit for this?
It was because Ebert said it was a Spartacist uprising. He called it a Spartacist uprising so he could then justify the suppression of the KPD and its members.
What were the Spartacists?
The Spartacists were the left wing of the USPD, which then broke off to join and form the KPD. So, following these events, the uprising occurs, all of these workers march in the streets, and that is the point at which Ebert sends in the Freikorps. He, of course, doesn't give them any instruction, doesn't tell them, here are your rules of engagement. They had carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do, and they did. They deployed flamethrowers, they deployed mortars, They deployed machine guns. And, of course, the leftists within that organization gave up pretty much immediately. They raised the white flag and said, we're done. And the Freikorps killed them where they stood. Without trial, executed all of them. They went to the separate houses in which Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who again were not leaders of this uprising, went in, took them out, beat them, tortured them, murdered them, dumped Rosa Luxemburg's body in the river. There was no due process. There was no, let's figure out what's going on and then let's deal with it. It was just a matter of let's slaughter anyone and everyone who may or may not have been involved in this uprising.
All right, so we're at the end of the German Revolution. Okay. So how did this, which was supposed to be a positive outcome, transition into one of the worst fascist dictatorships of the entire history of humanity?
It's complicated. There's a process there, but I think the legitimizing of the Freikorps went a long way toward pushing Germany to the right, pushing it to nationalism.
What would you compare the Freikorps to in modern times in the U.S.?
I don't know that there is a direct
Before
comparison.
they became legitimate.
Right. I think it's difficult to say. Blackwater, whatever the hell they're calling themselves now, they've changed names like 3 times.
So all military veterans,
Paramilitary,
guns for hire now, and they've been legitimized.
Yes, they've been legitimized by Ebert, and I don't know. It's a big what if. If Ebert had gone after nationalists the way he went after communists, none of this might have happened. It's hard to say. It's really difficult to say, but there was no...
Hitler and Nazi Party.
Right. I mean, Germany's economy was bent on collapsing because of many factors, but one of which obviously being the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, the amount of debt
that they had to pay to rebuild Belgium and France.
It's a conveniently forgotten fact.
But that was pushing Germany toward financial collapse. But the reason that communism or socialism or something of that nature did not rise up to fill the gap had a lot to do with the fact that Ebert destroyed the left wing in Germany and the fact that he legitimized nationalism via the support of the Freikorps, the fact that he used right-wing nationalist spies, the fact that he...
early German McCarthy.
of sorts. And it's interesting, too, because he was even to the right of, I think, his party in general. The Weimar Republic was very left-wing for its time. It existed for, 14 years between the point at which the revolution ended to the point at which the Nazis rose. The Weimar Republic had vast social programs. They allowed, things like homosexuality, the study of such things. Sexuality was studied to an extensive degree, and unfortunately, all of that study was lost when the Nazis rose because they went and burned it all because they saw it as degeneracy. So there's a whole wealth of information that we lost on things of that nature.
Nazis are okay as long as we can prevent communism, right?
Exactly, and that is kind of Ebert's stance. So anyway, the German Workers' Party renamed itself a couple of times, but as they saw the popularity of socialist parties, they literally tacked the name socialism onto their party's name.
But so, real quick, because this is the point where people start to say, like, oh, well, Nazis were just socialists.
Right.
This is why I really want to dig deep into the fundamentals of the Nazi Party. Were they socialists, really?
No, not at all. I mean, that literally all they did was change their name. There was no platform change.
Why were they not socialists?
Because socialism is a matter of democratic control of the means of production, worker control of the state, or worker control of profit. Any of those things would I think, in somebody's mind, qualify as socialism. But the Nazis maintained the capitalist order, maintained capitalist control of the means of production. They subsidized heavily, which is one of those right-wing libertarian ideas of socialism, but that's not socialism. That's just the government giving taxpayer money to
Right. Social
capitalists.
programs are not socialism.
What we do now, essentially.
I mean,
the agriculture.
Volkswagen was not owned by the German government when they were making...
Right.
These vehicles. They were subsidized by the German government, and the German government was a major purchaser of goods. Same with Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss made all the Nazi uniforms, so, you know.
Hey.
Fuck those guys.
Similar to how American businesses today are subsidized by the federal government.
Right. It's no different than Northrop Grumman or Boeing or McDonnell Douglas. We subsidize those industries heavily, and then we purchase from them to a significant
epitome
They make money twice.
They make money twice.
Right. The epitome of revisionist history is if the U.S. gets overthrown, somebody will look back and be like, "Oh yeah, Boeing was actually, a socialist national fucking company."
Yeah, I mean,
because they contract most of their money to the U.S. government.
If the U.S. government hired all of those Boeing engineers to make their shit internally, it would not only save us a bunch of money, it would not be fascism. But economically, we are already a fascist state. Economically, we are already a fascist
Depressing,
state.
isn't it?
But anyway, getting back to the German Revolution, so the Freikorps, the leaders of the Freikorps were people who were officers or commanders, went on to be in the Nazi leadership, and that include Ernst Röhm, Rudolf Hess, and Heinrich Himmler. It's interesting, though, because Hitler saw them as a threat. Hitler did not see them as, these are my buddies, and I'm going to work with them forever, and this is the future. Let's continue to back the Freikorps. He made a big deal, in fact. He had a huge ceremony in which he retired the banners of the Freikorps in this, all this pageantry.
The irony, of course, of supporting like the right-wing line is that, oh, well, private everything, what the fuck ever. But the only private army that existed in Germany was abolished by Hitler because it was out of control, and you can't have any sort of right-wing line that doesn't fall into line with the party, and so you have this private army that exists outside of the system. It has to absolutely be abolished because it isn't under the control of the system itself.
Right, and Hitler murdered any member of the Freikorps who resisted.
A lot of them ended up with in his leadership as well. It was like one or the other. It was like you either win or you lose. You flip the coin, you get heads, you're a Hitler fucking general. You get tails, you're fucking executed.
and I think Ernst Röhm was actually one of them. He resisted, he got arrested, and then Hitler was like, you know what, buddy, second chances. Come on,
guy.
Hey, guy. So he abolished the Freikorps, and had Ebert done something similar again, we may not have seen anything like the rise of Nazism. Maybe we would have. It's hard to say. I mean, this is all speculation, conjecture.
So let's take that line. So what are the possible outcomes? I guess a couple possible outcomes of the German Revolution.
So let's look at the forks in the road.
Right.
Yeah.
So
and where it could have gone and where it actually went.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's look at number one, where it could have gone if the revolution had never happened, and number two, where it could have gone if Rosa had lived, right? If it had gone in a different direction.
I think if the revolution had never happened, I think things probably would have progressed much as they did. I think there would have been
Hitler certainly wouldn't have been.
It would have been a different nationalist group that took over, perhaps not as militaristic.
So if this would be like a centrist kind of scenario.
I'd say it'd still be right wing because I think
centrist is almost always right wing though.
Well, centrist is centrist. Centrist is literally in the middle, but I think that if the German Empire had not fallen and the German Empire had negotiated the peace, the terms would not have been significantly different. Maybe if the German High Command had been able to send the Navy out and they had obliterated the British Royal Navy, perhaps it would have put them in a stronger position. I don't know. But I think probably the conditions would have been still draconian. I think that conditions would have deteriorated. It's possible there would have been at that point a revolution of a socialist or communist nature because the communists would not have been put down at an early stage. which would have given them the opportunity as material conditions worsened for German people to rise up. If Ebert had aligned with the USPD, I think that would have probably been the best chance that Germany had for socialism. I think that would have been the best chance that the world had for worldwide communist revolution, because the problem is that when the German Revolution fell, and following the Kronstadt Rebellion, which is probably a whole other episode, Lenin himself got discouraged and began to reform the economy away from a planned communist economy and toward, market socialism, which, again, I'm not going to try to make a value judgment there, but there would have then been another power, especially within Western Europe, who would have been allied with the Soviets, who had virtually no allies at this point. So that would have been great. Yeah, I suppose as far as like great branches, Ebert siding with the USPD, probably the best thing that could have possibly happened.
So let's say that Ebert didn't side with the
KPD, USPD?
Exactly.
USPD.
Let's say Ebert never existed. What would be the other timeline? Okay, so if he hadn't been able to influence the nature of literally every political decision for Germany, the German Empire, whatever you want to say.
You went 88 miles per hour and killed Ebert. What happened?
Exactly.
I think that
you're on the Autobahn. You're like, you don't have a speed limit, therefore you run over Ebert. What happens then?
I think that the USPD, which at that point in time had more influence within the workers' councils, the soldiers' councils, the sailors' councils, I think that the councils themselves have more power. Ebert no longer has the ability to manipulate the Reichstag. Perhaps the period of dual power, instead of ending with the crushing of the workers' councils and the supremacy of the Reichstag, the workers' councils themselves take over, and you do see something like the Mueller-style council communism. And although Rosa had many criticisms for the Bolshevik Revolution in private, publicly she was always defensive of the Bolsheviks, because it's what we call critical support. Against capitalists, we're going to side with leftists, even though in private we may say, maybe that wasn't the best decision. So I think they would have had an ally in Western Europe, and that might have encouraged the proletariat in other Western countries to rise up, seeing the success in industrialized nations.
All right. We appreciate you coming out tonight, Jeremy, talking about the German Revolution. It's a topic that not very many people know about, but it's a very important piece of history that I think is relevant to a lot of us. It's that big, missing gap, that blank page that when you're turning through the history book. Even the leftist history books skip over that part.
And mirrors so much our modern American history.
Yeah, a little bit too much.
Yes.
All right. Again, thank everybody for listening. We appreciate all the support that we get. Obviously, it's rough tonight. It's going to be rough for a few weeks. What we want is kind of a roundtable discussion to highlight kind of the conversations that you have with your leftist friends, but also with a very specific kind of expertise to kind of bring about some knowledge for topics that people don't really know about. And on that note, the next episode that we will be doing in a couple of weeks will be on Syria, a topic that is very heavily contested among the left. Do we have critical support for Assad? Are we supporting the anarchists? Are we supporting Rojava and Assad in some weird amalgamation of leftist doesn't oppose anything? Like, what are we doing?
Just support ISIS.
That's what America does.
Do they kill Americans? All right, we're on board. No, so but no, it's an important discussion that we need to have, but with critical analysis. And so in a couple of weeks, we'll be tackling Rojava and Syria as well. Thank you guys for joining us. I appreciate all of the support that we've gotten tonight.
Yeah. Solidarity to all our
solidarity
to all our comrades out there listening. We need to keep up this fight for information and education right now, probably more so than anything else in our current material conditions. Mm-hmm. So thank you for tuning in. Recommend this to anybody who may or may not, be willing to listen to this.
If you want to drop comments underneath this podcast, or if you want
tell us what you want super episodes to be about.
We
need ideas. Brainstorm.
Anybody willing to join us on these talks?
Mhm.
Let us know.
Hell yeah.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Goodbye.